Murder and Such contains true stories about murders, the macabre, true crime, serial killers, and other dark subject matter. This includes adult themes, explicit language, descriptions of gore, violence, and other information provided by news articles, witness testimony, and public record. Murder and Such is not intended for all audiences, and although warnings will be set in place, listener discretion is still advised.
So, I'm sorry about the massive delay with this episode. As I'm sure all of us are now aware with the current state of the COVID-19 virus, I took some time off from the show to collect my marbles. I'm sorry if I didn't update any of you or put anything out into the audio space for you to listen to. It's been, well, pretty crazy for all of us. Whether you're elderly, immunocompromised, or you know someone who can be severely affected by this virus, it's been a very trying and uncertain time for all of us. I myself am immunocompromised, being diabetic, and back in 2007 I was also diagnosed with tuberculosis, which has affected my lungs. I know I shouldn't smoke, but I'm doing everything I can to try to limit my time outside and my interactions face-to-face with another person. But we will get through this. I can guarantee that. What I've been doing to help me through this quarantine is try and relax and offer my help to those who need it. I think that's something that we can all learn from how much a community can come together to help those in need. Whether it's picking up some supplies for someone who may not have a vehicle, taking some toilet paper to a friend 40 minutes away, or donating to a local food bank, we can always do something to help our fellow person. But another thing that I've said on this podcast multiple times is how we should call someone that we love today. Someone who you've been thinking about, maybe somebody in the back of your mind that you just want to reach out to. Now would be the perfect time to do that, and I honestly think that you should. We all should. Also, don't be a dick and keep the elderly in mind, and don't buy an entire pallet of toilet paper. As my favorite YouTuber says, don't be stupid. But if you look for updates, there's some great sources out there that aren't biased media companies. I typically go with Reuters and the Associated Press, as well as experts who were involved in this pandemic, including the official Center for Disease Control website at cdc.gov. Knowledge is power in these times, and it can be power to save your own life, as well as those around you. Wash your hands, practice good personal hygiene, and stay informed. Again, we will get through this together. Now, as far as Patreon shoutouts go, I'd like to extend a massive thank you to my brand new patrons. So thank you so much to Martha Pierce, Casey Locke, Caitlin Poehler, Lydia Whittle, and Jessica Doiron for being so gracious and generous and deciding to jump on the Patreon page. You guys really help me out with the show, and I can't thank you enough for everything that you do. You are all amazing. Also, I do hope that all of the patrons have now received the new sticker design. I did make a small batch order of a new design that you can see if you're following the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. If you didn't see it, the new sticker is actually of Richard Chase himself, with Murder and Such kind of overlaying his eyes a little bit. But you can get your hands on them right now just by donating to the Murder and Such Patreon page at patreon.com/murderandsuch, or you can visit murderandsuch.com for more info. So thank you to all 5 of you lovely ladies for joining the Patreon page. Now let's start getting into this episode. Now, the United States legal system is tricky. Of course, a lot of us will think that the worst crime imaginable is murder. But to others, there might be far worse crimes than taking the life of someone else. And In the United States, as of 2016, there were 859,500 registered sex offenders residing within this country. That number apparently by the fall of 2019 says that there is 752,000 registered sex offenders. Of course, we've all heard the term Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 sex offender, those varying depending on the offenses, with Tier 3 sex offenders being the most severe of them all. A Tier 1 sex offender is someone who is convicted of a sexual offense not including the other two tiers. The Act defines a sex offense as a crime involving a sexual act or sexual contact with another, specified crimes against minors, specified federal crimes, or an attempt or conspiracy to commit one of them. Certain foreign crimes and certain crimes involving consensual sexual conduct are excluded, but certain juvenile adjudication are included. A Tier 1 sex offender must register for 15 years, but with a clean record, the registration is reduced to 10 years. This can include such things as pandering obscenity, menacing by stalking with motivation, gross sexual imposition, or voyeurism. Now, a Tier 2 sex offender is someone convicted of an offense punishable by more than 1 year in prison that is committed against a minor and is comparable or more severe than one of the following federal crimes or attempt or conspiracy to commit one of them, which are sex trafficking, coercion or enticement, transportation with intent to engage in criminal activity or abusive sexual contact. It also includes somebody using a minor in a sexual performance, soliciting a minor for prostitution, or producing or distributing child pornography. Or lastly, a Tier 2 sex offender is someone who was a Tier 1 offender and had offended once again. The crime, as stated previously, is that of more than 1 year in prison based on the severity of the crime, plus they must register as a sex offender for 25 years. Now, a Tier 3 offender is, quote, the worst tier that you can get. A Tier 3 offender are people who are convicted of an offense that is punishable by more than 1 year and is comparable or more severe than one of the following federal crimes or conspiracy or an attempt to commit any of them: aggravated sexual abuse, or abusive sexual contact against a minor under the age of 13. If it involves kidnapping a minor, unless the offender is a parent or guardian, or if it happens when a Tier 2 sexual offender commits another act, they are upgraded to a Level 3 sex offender. This offense requires that you must register as a sex offender for the rest of your natural life, unless they are a juvenile delinquent, to which the cases of registration are lowered to 25 years, but if they maintain a clean record, it will be expunged. Brock Turner, who is currently living about 8 miles away from this very studio, is classified as a Level 3 sex offender, and he will register his home address, place of employment, and must check in with an officer every 90 days for the rest of his fucking life. If only it was life in prison that little shithead got. But I digress. If you didn't know what the tiers were, now you do. So I hope that you learned something today, but what I want to focus on for this episode is something that does involve a sex offender, but the offender is not the culprit in this case. You'll probably be finding yourself questioning whether or not you support this man and asking yourself the age-old question of, will an eye for an eye leave the whole world blind? But as always, my name is Hunter, and you're listening to Murder and Such. And this is episode 62, Jonathan Watson. December 3rd, 2008, Cutten, California. The home of 27-year-old man by the name of Garrett Benson, a UPS driver for 7.5 years and a former member of the National Guard, and his girlfriend, Rachel Wold. 2 men are also involved, are a 31-year-old man by the name of Jason Leon Bells, and with him, a 30-year-old man by the name of Jonathan Henry Watson. Now, while Garrett had been a former member of the National Guard for 9 years, serving 1 year in Utah and 1 year in Sinai, Egypt, but on that night he was just enjoying his evening with his girlfriend. But he might have been involved in some less than savory extracurricular activities, specifically marijuana growing and distribution. On that evening, Garrett and his girlfriend heard a knock at the door. When Garrett got up and went to open the door, he found himself being shoved inside of his home, with both men entering his house. These men knew exactly who Garrett was and was coming to rob him of all marijuana and money that he had within his 4 walls. When they entered the house, Rachel was terrified for her life, and both men were wearing masks and had loaded guns with them. Watson had made a feeble attempt to restrain Garrett while inside of his living room of the house, but Garrett had decided to fight back against his attacker. After a short fight, Watson had pulled out his handgun and fired multiple shots, striking Garrett 3 times and mortally wounding him. The men left all drugs, money, and Rachel behind, tending to her dying boyfriend. They got into a car and left the property, then drove off to Redding, California, to Jason's house. After she had called the police and they came to investigate, they lifted Garrett into an ambulance, where hours later he would be pronounced dead at the hospital. An attempt to rob a man of weed and money had now turned into a first-degree murder charge, but those charges wouldn't come until over a week later. Now, as far as the description of the attackers go, there isn't much that Rachel could describe about Jason Bells. But when it came to Jonathan Watson, there were multiple tattoos that couldn't be hid from plain sight. Jonathan had multiple tattoos across his arms, hands, and then a 1950s style condenser microphone tattooed on his throat, as well as multiple tattoos on his face and the sides of his neck. But the microphone was a very distinctive tattoo. When Rachel gave her statement to the police, the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office started to investigate in collaboration with the Shasta County Sheriff's Department. Now, Jason did have a house in Redding that was located on Marlene Avenue, but when it came to Jonathan, the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office spokeswoman Brenda Godsey had stated that, quote, "He seems to be kind of a transient," end quote. He had no formal address and was pretty disheveled, but I'm not one to judge a book by its cover, but when you look at the guy, he seems to be a pretty sketchy dude. As you can tell from the artwork of this episode, with the mohawk and the tattoos, he doesn't seem like someone very trustworthy. But it takes a lot for me to say that, considering my piercings and tattoos. But Jonathan was definitely transient. He would find himself in Redding, Cottonwood, and Cutting for different reasons, because he had no real job and no place to call his own, and by 2008 standards, he was pretty much a drifter. But unbeknownst to him, his lack of self-awareness about his neck tattoos and how distinctive he looked was what snagged him up. The following Thursday, on December 11th of 2008, at about 7 o'clock p.m., the Humboldt County detectives had arrested Jonathan Henry Watson in Cottonwood, California, on suspicion of robbery of an inhabited dwelling, false imprisonment, burglary, and the murder of Garrett Benson. Now, one thing of note is the location. There's something I wanted to touch on just a little bit, and that's because Humboldt County, California has been at the epicenter before, mainly the 6-part docuseries that's on Netflix called Murder Mountain. The series taps into the mysterious culture of marijuana farming and the industry in the area, which mainly focuses around the case of another person named Garrett, but this time Garrett Rodriguez, who was a farmer and then he was found murdered in 2013. This information kept popping up when I was doing research on this case, but Garrett Benson was killed 5 years prior. Either way, the industry itself has become a booming one and can be extremely profitable considering California's medicinal usage of marijuana has been in place since 1996, and in 2016 it was legalized for recreational usage. But Murder Mountain uncovers a lot of strange disappearances that have happened in Humboldt County area, stretching back to even further than the 2008 murder that I'm discussing in this case. So needless to say, this isn't the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office's first rodeo with a murder that has been linked to the marijuana industry. So after Jonathan was arrested, he had waived his Miranda rights and started talking to the police about who else he had with them. Then one day later, on Friday, December 12th of 2008, a warrant was issued at around 12:30 that afternoon for the Reading Police Department and Reading Fugitive Task Force to arrest 31-year-old Jason Leon Bells, in which they executed it on his property at about 1:45 in the afternoon, and he was brought in without incident. His charges included a robbery of an inhabited dwelling, conspiracy, and also for the murder of 27-year-old Garrett Benson. The Humboldt County Sheriff's Department continued to investigate the crimes with the Reading area, with collaboration with the local authorities, and both men are held in the Humboldt County Jail until a pretrial hearing, and then their actual trials were set to begin. Now, it kind of says something about Jonathan to drag his accomplice under the bus with him, since it doesn't seem like he really cares much about human life as a whole in this situation. Well, the facts that he faced were the ones that he tried restraining Garrett to the ground and ended up pulling out the pistol, then shot Garrett 3 times, eventually killing him. Now, with that information, the both of them entered not guilty pleas in front of their first arraignment. The case kind of goes quiet for around 8 months, but with Jonathan being the one that pulled the trigger and facing life in prison, and with the conspiracy to commit murder against Jason, he was also facing some hefty time in prison as well. But Jason started working with the Humboldt County prosecutors to start working on a deal for him for lesser charges. And that brings us all the way to August 21st of 2009, when Jason came first to face the judge. According to timestandard.com, in an article posted on August 22nd of 2009 written by Allison White, it stated that, quote, "The family and friends of shooting victim Garrett Benson filled a Humboldt County courtroom Friday to witness the sentencing of one man for his death, while a second defendant in the case moved to contest his plea." Watson initially accepted a plea deal August 11th from Deputy County Attorney Max Cardoza for first-degree murder with a firearm enhancement and agreed upon a prison term of 50 years to life. On Friday, he contested his previous plea, end quote. So this court date was not for Jonathan Watson, but for Jason Bells. It goes on to say that, quote, "Bells was sentenced to 7 years and 8 months in prison, minus the time already served, with a 3-year parole term upon release as agreed to in his plea deal. He will also have to pay a $1,400 restitution fine. With good behavior, he could be released in about 6.5 years, end quote. A lot of Garrett's family and friends were there, and a quote from Garrett's father, Randy Benson, said, quote, "My world has changed. My beliefs aren't the same anymore. I've been silenced by disgust and have been since the murder of my son, Garrett." He fought back tears as he told the court that Garrett Benson was a man of integrity. He described his son as motivated, hilarious, responsible, loyal, intelligent, kind, and patriotic. With him addressing both Jason and Jonathan at his appearance, Randy said that he would never be able to forgive them, although the others had advised him to. To that he said, "My God, and I will have to wrestle with this one." Jonathan showed no expression at all during anyone speaking. Garrett's mother had described Garrett as a practical joker, a head of his household, would often come over to her house and chop wood for her or send a bouquet of flowers to her. Susan had said, quote, "If you ever saw a vehicle covered in post-it notes, you knew that Garrett had struck again." Now finally, Garrett's girlfriend Rachel was in attendance, and she told them that she hoped that one day they would understand the gravity of what they had done, stating, quote, "Garrett saved my life. I sat with him and had to watch the life fade from his eyes," end quote. With that, Jason was taken away and started his 7-year sentence, but Jonathan's fate still lied with the prosecution and his attempt at contesting his prior guilty plea. In another article published by thetimestandard.com and written again by Allison White on August 29th of 2009, it stated that the following Monday, on August 24th of 2009, Jonathan was attempting to revoke his prior no contest guilty plea, stating that he was not fully competent due to the medications that he was taking when he first entered his plea. The second part to his contest was that he felt that he was not properly represented by his defense attorney, Kathy Dreyfus. The court, however, determined that there wasn't sufficient evidence to warrant a separate counsel review to Kathy's representation of Jonathan. Now, both attempts at trying to contest his plea were dismissed by the judge, Bruce Watson, saying that, quote, "I believe that Mr. Watson was in full possession of his faculties at the time of his plea," end quote. Yes, the judge and Jonathan's last names are both Watson. Now, the judge had set Jonathan's sentencing for later in the week on Friday, August 28th. Again, Garrett's mother Susan was in attendance at his sentencing, stating how proud she was of her son and who he might have become. She said, quote, "I doubt I will accomplish any greater thing than raising a responsible child," end quote. She later went on to say, quote, "I should have liked to have entered a charge of attempted robbery of me, the robbery of a loving son," end quote. In an excerpt from Garrett's obituary also had a poem, and that read, "Afterglow. I'd like to be the memory of me to be a happy one. I'd like to leave an afterglow of smiles when life is done. I'd like to leave an echo whispering softly down the ways of happy times and laughing times and bright and sunny days. I'd like the tears of those who grieve to dry before the sun of happy memories that I leave when life is done." Also in attendance was Garrett's sister Erica, who said she wasn't sure how her family will survive without her brother's cheerful demeanor and that his death had affected many. She was quoted saying, "You may have murdered one man, but you've slaughtered the souls of hundreds of people in this community." Now lastly, Garrett's girlfriend had said that she didn't feel safe in her own home, but she wasn't going to let that fear overcome her. She was quoted telling Jonathan, the man who entered her boyfriend's home, wrestled with him to the ground, and shot him 3 times in front of her very eyes, that, quote, "You're a coward who hides behind a mask and a gun." Now, Jonathan, maybe or maybe not understanding the gravity of his crimes, faced each of these victims while stoic, emotionless, and without a shred of sympathy or empathy for them. When it was said and done, he was sentenced for first-degree murder with a firearm enhancement and was to spend the next 50 years of his life behind bars. And if he's released from jail, he will be on parole for the rest of his natural life, which would be short-lived as he would be 81 years old by the time he sees the outside world once again as a free man. He is still in prison to this day. And the family of Garrett Benson may never recover, including his girlfriend Rachel, for the loss of their son, their brother, their boyfriend. It's hard to comprehend what a mistake or a violent crime in pulling a trigger can affect the lives of not only yourself, but the ones that have been touched by Garrett Benson. I'd say 50 years is a pretty good sentence for what he did. He murdered a man. He will pay the price for it. But as it's now been a while since I first started talking about this, What does any of this have to do with sex offenders? Like I said, to some, murder may be the worst crime that one can commit. But what if to somebody else, it isn't? Depending on where you fall with your own personal code of conduct or ideologies, maybe murder isn't the worst thing in the world. But when you're locked behind bars for half a century, it makes me think of a particular proverb. There is no honor amongst thieves. This sentiment is that all thieves are criminals, and criminals will do each other dirty sometimes. The proverb itself first started appearing in the early 1800s. I'm sure, if you're into true crime, you've probably seen or heard some TV or stories about some truly horrific acts that can happen with prisoners, both with corrections officers and themselves while incarcerated. Sometimes it can be a cutthroat world in the clink, and with no honor amongst thieves, someone could possibly be an ally to you at one point, but might turn into the executioner who flips the switch on you. But that brings me to the internet. What a wonderful and fucked up thing sometimes. Chances are you've probably seen a headline come across your Twitter or Facebook newsfeed about this case, about this man, and what he did to two men while he was in prison.
Officials are investigating the death of a convicted child molester who was attacked by another inmate at a California state prison. 41-year-old Jonathan Watson attacked two inmates with a weapon, causing multiple head wounds to both. The inmates were taken to a medical center and one died on the way to the hospital, according to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. The other remains in critical condition. The inmate who died was identified as 48-year-old David Bobb. He was serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole for aggravated sexual assault of a child under 14 years old.
Officials at a California substance abuse treatment facility and state prison, Corcoran, are investigating the death of an inmate on Facility A as a homicide. On January 16, 2020, at approximately 2:34 p.m., correctional officers responded when inmate Jonathan Watson, 41, attacked two inmates with a weapon, causing multiple head wounds to both victims. Medical staff continued life-saving measures while waiting for the ambulances for both injured inmates. Both were transported to a local medical center. However, one inmate succumbed to his injuries while en route to the hospital and was pronounced dead at 4:04 p.m. The other inmate remains in critical condition at an outside area hospital. Watson was received by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation from Humboldt County on September 4, 2009, to serve a life with the possibility of parole for first-degree murder and intentionally discharging a firearm causing great bodily injury or death. The deceased victim has been identified as inmate David Bobb, 48, who was received by the CDCR from San Diego County on October 17, 2005, to serve a life with the possibility of parole sentence for aggravated sexual assault of a child under 14 years old. SATF's Investigative Service Unit and the Kings County Coroner's Office are investigating. SATF opened in Kings County in 1997 and houses level 2, 3, and 4 inmates. The institution specializes in substance abuse treatment, houses more than 5,400 inmates, and employs nearly 2,000 people. This was a press release from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation Center. February of 2020. MercuryNews.com, based out of San Jose, California, receives a letter from the California State Prison in Corcoran, California. The letter being written by Jonathan himself, signed and dated, and Corcoran being his recent home after being transferred there shortly before. Jonathan was very candid and not his emotionless self that he was just shy of 11 years prior when facing the family and friends of Garrett Benson. He was honest about his mental health, and it seemed as if he was trying to justify his homicides to an extent. The one part about that official statement was that he killed not just one, but 2 inmates that day. The deceased are, of course, David Bobb, who was 48 years old at the time of his death, but the other was a 62-year-old male by the name of Graham DeLewis Conti, who had died at an area hospital 3 days after Jonathan's beating. Both deaths have been listed as homicides. Now, Graham DeLewis Conti was also serving a life sentence after being convicted of aggravated sexual assault involving children under the age of 14. So both of the men were convicted Tier 3 sex offenders. But what made Jonathan tip over the edge? It said in the article published by Mercury News that Jonathan said he had been given a lower level security classification, which dropped him from a level 3 security to a level 2, and instead of being isolated to a single person cell, it was mandated that he was transferred to a dorm living style classification. But Jonathan contested that because he knew that he was a danger to people. He called it, quote, a careless mistake, and said that he left quite the paper trail of grievances to him protesting the lower security and new living conditions. With it being only 6 days into the dorm-style living, he stated that a child molester had moved into the pool of men within his unit. This infuriated him to no end, but although he murdered Garrett Benson a little over a decade ago, he did what he thought was necessary. The day of the attack, specifically 2 hours prior, he went to a prison counselor with an urgent request that he be transferred back to level 3 security, and stated, quote, before I really fuck one of these dudes up, end quote. But he said that they just scoffed and dismissed him. I give him credit for being able to tell how fast his anger sharks are swimming on that day, but it takes someone to know what they are capable of, whether it be murder or not, and talking to any of the powers that be to try and get a resolution before there's even a bigger problem. But I would also like to state that a lot of corrections officers, keep in mind, not all of them, but a lot of them look at prisoners as someone who may not be trustworthy and may be looking for something to get out of a situation when throwing around a veiled threat such as Jonathan did. Sometimes they will see them as subhuman, but they are human nonetheless. So getting back to what tipped Jonathan over the edge, the day before the attack, Jonathan was sitting in prison, obviously, in which he was in a room with a few other inmates, including David Bobb, who went up to the television in the room and made the mistake of turning the TV to the PBS Kids channel. Even in prison, David Bobb couldn't get children out of his mind, but that was a mistake that would cost him his life. Jonathan said it in his letter to Mercury News that, quote, I could not sleep not having done what every instinct told me I should have done right then and there, so I packed all of my things because I knew one way or the other the situation would be resolved the following day, end quote. And well, it was. The following day, Thursday, January 16th of 2020, Jonathan found himself at the same room with the same TV, and the same David Bobb had again flipped the television to PBS Kids. As Jonathan stated in his letter, quote, I was mulling it over when it came to Molester 1, and he put his TV right on PBS Kids again. But this time, someone else said something to the effect of, is this guy really gonna watch this right in front of us? And Jonathan recalled saying, quote, I got this, and I picked up the cane and I went to work on him, end quote. At that moment, David Bobb laid motionless on the prison floor, and Jonathan had decided that he was going to tell the corrections officer what he had just done. What he had done was grabbed another prisoner's cane and proceeded to bludgeon David Bobb hitting him multiple times in the head, fracturing his skull, lacerating his face and body, and causing severe damage to him. With the brutal beating of David, he started towards the officer's post, but he knew he would be elevated to level 3 security, if not level 4, and he would be serving the rest of his life in prison from this moment forward. So on his way, he stated in the letter that, quote, "As I got to the lower tier, I saw a known child trafficker, and I just figured I'd do everybody a favor. In for a penny, in for a pound," end quote. Then proceeded to viciously beat Graham DeLewis Conti with the same cane that he used to beat David Bobb. Now 2 men lie on the prison floor in a pool of their own blood, having infuriated a man who had killed before. Now, as Jonathan said, he went to an officer after the beating and failed to get any sort of attention from them, and he told the guard, "I've got some pretty bad news." But Jonathan said that the officer ironically had stated, "You're not gonna hit me with that cane, are you?" So Jonathan stated, quote, "So after jesting for a moment, knowing this might be the last decent moment that I have for a long time, I told him what I had just done, which he also didn't believe until he looked around the corner and saw the mess I had made in the dorm area," end quote. It was after the other officers locking down the prison and examining the area that they found both David Bobb and Graham DeLewis Conti, both motionless, beaten to a pulp, and they had detained Jonathan Watson for the now attempted murder of 2 inmates. Not only in the letter to the Mercury News was he candid and honest, but also to the prison officials, he was just as blunt and honest about his murders. He had nothing to hide, and he tried mentioning to them before that moving him to a dorm facility was a bad idea. Now, as you heard in the statement, David Bobb died in transit to the local hospital at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, finally succumbing to his injuries. Graham DeLewis Conti died 3 days later on January 19th of 2020, finally also succumbing to his injuries. Now, as far as the honesty and justification, Jonathan wrote to Mercury News stating that, quote, "Being a lifer, I'm in a unique position where I sometimes have access to these people and I have so little to lose. And trust me, we get it. These people are every parent's worst nightmare. These families spend years carefully and articulately planning how to give their children every opportunity that they never had, and one monster comes through and changes that child's trajectory forever," end quote. Now, also included with the article from Mercury News, they had a statement from a man by the name of Robert Hood, who was a retired prison warden who spent 3 years in charge of a federal supermax prison in Colorado. And he stated that, quote, "With the division that occurs between white-collar criminals, drug addicts, different gangs, and all that, one magnet that usually pulls them together truly is the sex offender. I'm not going to sound like a bleeding heart here, but the chemistry we put people into certain prison environments is not healthy for anyone, especially the person at the bottom of the totem pole, which is the sex offender," end quote. So, bringing this back around, Jonathan was a murderer before. That's without a doubt, and a half a century behind bars also agreed with that. But with your own personal moral compass, do you see what he did as justified in any way, shape, or form? Do you think that the world is now a better place without those 2 men walking around and watching PBS Kids in prison? Personally, I saw the PBS programming as a taunt, because if you've got an extended stay in prison, you may have to make some rash decisions to let people know that you're not one to be fucked with. With a convicted sex offender putting PBS Kids on TV, I would say that he kind of put the target on his back willingly. But does that justify Jonathan Watson's decision to take their lives? That is the moral question. These 2 convicted child molesters were never going to see the outside of the prison ever again. But does that mean that because of Jonathan's failed attempts at getting moved back to level 3 security and the taunting of David Bobb mean that he has the moral superiority or capabilities to take these men's lives while behind bars? Well, the world is a very mixed bag. When Mercury News published that article on February 20th of 2020, there was a whole heap of opinions about the matter. A long list of media outlets, including the LA Times, picked up the story, and people did not hold their digital tongues back when talking about it. A Twitter user by the name of Chodman had said, quote, "I see no problem with this," end quote. And another user by the name of Dinsdale Piranha said, quote, "Dear John, thank you for your service," end quote. Another person by the name of Kevin Oneway said, "Okay, I don't see a problem with the first part, but with him being ignored after warning people, they should be held accountable as well, not him." Another person named Mariana Gainim had said, "This man is a legend, a hero, should be praised, hashtag BAMF, which means badass motherfucker. We should all be Jason Watsons," end quote. But people also took to other means to show their respect and gratitude towards him. In a post on February 21st, 2020 on Twitter by the username of @TracksuitsOn had posted, quote, "National hero, for his last 2 murders only. Jonathan Watson has been blocked by the California Corrections from receiving further funds from his fans. Guess he won't have endless Hunger Games money on his books for his deeds. America, send him tagless white tees." But he also posted, quote, "Murder is bad, very bad, but I'm willing to give Jonathan Watson 2 mulligans for his last 2. Murder? What murder? No murder, no crime," end quote. Now, like I said, this went across everything, from me getting direct messages on Instagram about it, even on Facebook or Twitter or even on Reddit. A lot of people had their opinions, and a person named Eric on Facebook had stated that, quote, "The prison guard and counselor need to be disciplined harshly for ignoring this inmate's 2 warnings, as they're supposed to maintain a level of safety and security in a place like that. Beyond that, I have 0 remorse for the 2 deaths. Absolutely none," end quote. But there were also multiple GoFundMe accounts created for Jonathan on behalf of the general public to go into his commissary account. But most of them were taken down as it violated GoFundMe's guidelines for what you can and can't fund. Some people were even petitioning for him to be released from prison, thus nullifying him murdering Garrett Benson, and some people even thinking that President Trump should be pardoning him because he took out 2 child molesters. But that begs the question, is what he did right? Did him taking the lives of 2 child molesters redeem himself in the society's eyes? When he was 30, he killed a brother, a boyfriend, a veteran, and a son in a failed robbery. He was given 50 years because of this. Does an eye for an eye leave the whole world blind? Because I do agree with him on his statement about parents spending their whole lives thinking of ways to provide for their children, keep them safe from pain, distress, and predators, just trying to show them a life that they may or may not have had, but then one monster comes along and leaves them emotionally, mentally, and or physically scarred for life. Children are definitely innocent victims, and when it comes to them becoming victims from a predator who very well knows better than to put their hands on a child, I have no sympathy for those child molesters. But Jonathan knew and said that he would take out a child molester in prison. But that doesn't deter from the fact that the guards and prison counselor did literally nothing about it. They played it off like something wasn't even awry with him, even though he left quite the trail of his protests about him being housed with the general population. I would say that the overwhelming public has forgiven him for the murders of David Bobb and Graham DeLewis Conti. But I don't think that he has been forgiven and shouldn't be forgiven for killing Garrett Benson. He honestly shouldn't be. Would I like to have seen him better himself and possibly be released from prison when he's 81? Sure. Because we should all want people to better themselves, own up to their mistakes, and make it good with society. But for Jonathan Henry Watson, he will never see the outside world ever again, and with the 2 additional murders that he tacked onto his record earlier this year, John Watson will die in prison. But that's all I have for this episode. I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of Murder and Such, and as always, I am your host, Hunter. If you would like to help support Murder and Such and offset the cost of production, research, editing, and all that shit, I ask you to consider visiting my Patreon page at patreon.com/Murder and Such. And if you'd like to follow the show on social media, you can find it on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Murder and Such. And if you would like to follow me personally, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, the PlayStation Network, and Snapchat at Huntor27. But thank you again to my lovely patrons, my friends, and most of all, thank you for listening. I apologize again for the delay. We are living in very trying times, but I will try my best to be back a little more frequently, hopefully getting back to the 1 episode every 2 week schedule. But this has been kind of a shorter episode, but as always, I thank you for listening, and I will talk to you soon. Take care. And wash your fucking hands!